Thanks, Brenda. Thanks, everybody at PEP for inviting me again. I gave a presentation here, let's see, in October. I'm really happy that you invited me back. And I know that there have been a couple of different, actually a series by Doug Corver on feeding the pullet and those sorts of things. And so today I'm going to concentrate a bit on early life and some housing for pullet laying hens, and also talk about some of the research that has been ongoing in my laboratory in this area. And if I can get my slide to advance, there we go. So thinking about early life of pullets or early life of laying hens, if we go back 10 years ago, there wasn't a lot of work on developmental aspects, at least of pullets for life in other areas except for conventional cages. When hens were kept in conventional cages for the last 50 years or so, there wasn't a lot of room for maneuver. And beside feeding them, which there was work in nutritional aspects, but even that has grown a lot, not a lot of attention was paid to the early life of the animal. And this is true, I think, for other livestock species as well. Heifers were pretty much ignored, and just now the research is really increasing, and part of it is the structure of the industries. If there's a different person or a different farm is rearing versus taking the adult section of life, the two may not connect. But we know now, when we're working in alternative housing systems, some of the alternatives like the furnished cage systems, like the ones that you see here, or enriched colonies, which are probably going to be the predominant type of housing system in the near future in Canada. These are usually have a lot more hens in them, and they're a bit more complex, with perches provided for the birds, nest areas, and scratch mats for them as well. The most complex, and probably the place where now we know that early life has a huge effect on how laying hens fare, productivity and behavior and welfare wise, are the cage-free aviaries. And like the ones that you see here, they're very large. We've given hens opportunities for more freedom of movement and expression of behavior, but we still have very large groups, and they're very complex environments. And we have to remember that the laying hen actually is they evolved from red jungle fowl, and they're a ground dwelling species, and they're really not built to go up. And aviaries, because of the scale and the ability to go up, you can keep more hens on a footprint of land. They've become one of the most popular ways for cage-free housing. However, there may not be the most suitable for the bird necessarily, and that she has to be able to navigate, perch, fly between different areas. She has to find the nests on certain tiers. In aviaries, there'll be a litter area at the bottom that birds will have to figure out how to get to and from those. And as I mentioned, they're ground dwelling, and in the wild, their ancestors would only go up into the trees probably at night to avoid predators, and that's about it. And now in these systems, they have to find food and water and nests and navigate amongst all their group mates in these systems. And practical experience and now growing bodies of research have shown that we know that good health, productivity, and welfare in these kind of systems, they require birds that are calm, smart, and physically fit. And so I have my little yoga hen here showing that she needs to be in the zone. She needs to have good muscle strength, good skeletal strength, and a good head on her shoulders, so that she can fare well and be quite successful and thrive in this type of a system. And so because of this, there's more and more investment that's being put in a research standpoint into how housing and management influences the laying hen during her early life. And we know, and research is showing more and more, that, of course, early experience of chicks and pullets can have lifelong effects on their behavior, health, and welfare. And when we think about early life, what do we mean by it? It's a pretty critical period for the development of everything having to do with the bird and the laying hen and how well she does, productivity as well as health wise. It's a critical period for rapid physical growth and development. I won't talk about the productivity aspects, but the development of the reproductive capacity of the bird is really set during her early life experience. But from a behavioral standpoint, her learning, her cognitive abilities, her ability to solve problems, which there are a lot of problems in those aviary systems, her navigational and motor skills, appropriate social behaviors, also learning and recognition of key stimuli for a variety of behaviors. For example, foraging in the forage and not feather pecking foraging on your group mate that causes feather pecking. And so this is a huge period that's important from the whole animal for developing adaptive coping strategies and stress responses. So there's our calm, smart, and physically fit bird. So when we think about what constitutes early life, within the chicken, of course, it's the prenatal period, or mammals as well, prenatal period. Okay, so this is before birth, and we know that even before birth influences a lot of aspects of behavior and physiological function of an animal, the perinatal period, which is around hatching in the bird, and the postnatal period, which starts with a chick, but goes all the way through her juvenile, prepubertal, and adolescence until she gets moved to the layer house and begins laying her eggs. So I'm not going to spend very much time at this, but just want to bring to your attention that the prenatal period, and you're talking about feeding the breeder hen. I am the seminar that's coming up. I assume that's going to be with the goal of how it impacts the broiler chicken. And so we know that the prenatal period is very important during for embryo development to get a healthy chick. And when we think about the laying hen, a lot of attention is probably put to the broiler breeder, less so for the pullet breeder. But we think about what influences the prenatal environment. Mammals, we can relate to it because the mammal, developing mammal, is inside of its mother. So you think, oh, everything that affects the mother, what she's eating, what her environment is, if she's stressed or not, that can influence her offspring. And we relate to this and other factors such as maternal age as well. But this is also true for the bird. And so in the case of birds, the experience of the mother or the breeder hen affects the composition of her egg. And so depending on how that hen is managed, how she's fed, but if she's stressed or not, that can also influence, she deposits hormones and different fatty acids, nutrients, egg size and egg weight are all affected by her experience, and some are affected by her stress response. And incubation conditions as well, then the temperature, the humidity, and the lighting. And this is really only starting to be explored in the laying hen. It's been studied more in the broiler chicken, but more and more we're looking back to the breeder flock. And when we think about laying hen and the breeder flock, there's very, very little research at all on layer breeders. And when you think about every layer breeder produces about 150 laying hens in her lifetime, there's really very few breeder flocks that affect all of the hens in that are in production. So when you think about there's still a lot. So those breeder flocks that have kind of flown under the radar need a lot more attention. And this is a growing area of research, but I'll save that for you for another time and day. Another area that's receiving more attention is the hatching environment. And when we think about the pullet or the chick, laying hen chick, when it hatches, she goes through a lot before she gets settled in the barn. And there's about 4 or 5 brand new papers this year on how hatchery stress influences later stress response and stress reactivity of birds. But I'm not going to talk about that today either. I'm going to concentrate on the rearing period because that's one that we've been focusing on a lot and have some exciting results, I think. And so we know, back to the rearing or the non-cage systems and aviaries, that rearing environments pretty important for hens going into aviaries. Chicks and pullets destined for conventional cages are typically reared in small barren cages. And when you don't have to be able to negotiate in a complex world, I think you can get along just fine. But we know that hens housed in complex aviaries must be reared in complex environments. And there's a requirement in our code of practice. It's not a requirement in other places in the world, but it's coming to be. So that we know that birds, if they don't fare well when they're being moved to the layer house, they can have difficulty finding food and water, and they can have more injuries growing up. So rearing in aviaries enhances spatial cognitive abilities, it improves the three-dimensional use of space, and it reduces fearfulness. And there are several studies that have shown this, but people are looking about in more depth what aspects of rearing actually makes a difference. And so we know that to a degree that there's sensitive periods for motor development and spatial learning. And this is true for perches, where perching it's an innate behavior, but it requires a critical period during development where the birds have to experience that, or else they don't develop as perching behavior as well as if they didn't experience it early on. And so spatial cognitive abilities improve with early exposure to perches. There's just a couple of studies, one by Gunnarsson in Sweden, that showed that perches provided at 1 week of age versus 8 weeks of age. Birds that got the perches later never did as well in the laying hen. And so early exposure to perches actually allows the bird to learn the three-dimensional environment. And perch use gradually increases. It starts in the first week and then gradually increases later on. And actually, this was first discovered with broiler breeders when, in the old days, when broiler breeder nests were located up high. Mike Appleby and Ian Duncan published some papers back in the early 80s showing that broiler breeders would lay a lot more floor eggs if they hadn't experienced a perch before. And so that's what the idea that, oh, there's a sensitive period during the plasticity of the brain where the hen or the bird requires that experience. So there's also, in addition to behavioral development and critical periods, musculoskeletal development is also very important during the early stages. And from human aspects, we know that osteoporosis and such, there's more and more interest in putting on a good skeleton in early life and how that influences bone integrity for a woman's, a human's, and animal's entire life. And part of the reason for this is the responses to bone loading and the mechanical loading is that the bone responds to mechanical loading. So there's sensory cells within the bone that actually respond to and are always sensing whether there's applied load from gravity, loads or strains that are applied from muscles pulling at different parts of the bone. And so when the bone senses the strains, it activates the osteoblasts and osteoclasts to actually get involved in bone remodeling and resorption. And so the bone is constantly responding to what's the environment and the type of motion and locomotion that the bird is going through. And this influences the growth response and then actually the shape and size of a bone. We always think of bones as kind of static things, but they're constantly changing and constantly responding to the loads that we have. And this is particularly true in the young animal. And you can actually change the shape of its bones, and we'll see some examples of that today, because of the type of exercise and movements that they're doing when they're young. And exercise increases bone mineral density. We know that in the adult, but so much so in the young animal, so that it can change the shape and structure of it. And this relates One reason that we're interested in this from the laying hen is because of the problem with osteoporosis in the bird. And this is a consequence of high egg production, mostly, and that the laying hen is using medullary bone as a calcium reserve. She's only putting on structural bone. So the cortical bone, which is the outside, the trabecular bone, which are the struts in the middle. These are the ones that give the bone strength. This is what the bird is putting on when she's in the growth phase. As soon as her estrogen levels increase and she begins preparing to go into lay, she switches over, putting on medullary bone. So this is the labile calcium reserve, but her cells still take bone from all the different types. So over the course of lay, she is diminishing the cortical bone in her body and putting on medullary bone. So over time, she develops severe osteoporosis. Another bone problem that really from a welfare standpoint, bones are only a problem, weak bones are only a problem if they get broken and cause pain and reduce, productivity or involve suffering for the bird. But one of the aspects that's a real problem in laying hens is the keel bone damage. And keel bone damage is studied in many labs around the world. It's become considered probably one of the major welfare issues in laying hens now that they're in environments that they can either have collisions and break the keel. So the keel is this bone in front that has where the muscle attachments for the breast are, so that if the bird is flying or has to fly, it involves the keel bone. And we know that these can be highly prevalent in non-cage systems. We see all different numbers. A lot of birds experience fractures by the end of lay. We know from a couple of studies that they suggest that they're painful and limit mobility. And some of them occur during falls and collisions. Although a lot of them, so the falls and collisions, you'll see here's the keel, there may be fractures here, but we also see a lot of keel bone fractures down at this caudal tip as well, which we think might be due to something else. So one of the studies that we started out a number of years ago, looking at exercise in early life and how rearing environment influences the skeletal properties of the laying hen, was a study done by Teresa Casey Trott a couple years ago, 2017. It's already getting a bit long in the tooth, where we reared birds in conventional rearing cages versus rearing aviaries. So these were LSL lights in this case, and they were reared in either the standard rearing cages, or this is an example of one of the rearing aviaries that we have at our research station, where the birds grow up in, there's a central compartment. I'll show you more about this later. And then these are opened up. This is like an open concept system. And here the birds have the ability to run and fly and jump from one day of age. In standard cages, there's very little room for opportunity, particularly later on. And in this study, we collaborated with Doug Corver on this and published several years ago in Poultry Science. And the main gist of this was that rearing in cages versus aviaries, pullets reared in aviaries, first of all, had larger keels. So we did measured bones and muscles, bone strength, long-term mineral densities of these bones. And here's a picture of a keel where we've quantified them, the size and area of them. And the birds reared in that aviary had larger keels. They had heavier pectoral muscles, that's a breast muscle, stronger bones, and bones with greater cortical area. And this, after rearing, these birds were put into enriched colonies, and we followed them. So then they were all in the same environment. We followed them to the end of lay, and those early life differences lasted forever, okay, till they were 72 weeks of age. And so note in these, we say there are opportunities for exercise. And this is an important point because we didn't actually measure exercise or what the birds did in these. So we thought it's got to be due to exercise. There's one other area that we found that had an effect, and that's the birds in that were reared in the aviaries also had fewer keel fractures. So shown here, this is from this paper, the prevalence of keel bone damage. So these birds were raised in either a conventional rearing cage, or they were raised in a commercial style aviary, and then they were put into enriched colonies, and we collected them, data on them throughout the laying period, and found that in terms of fractures, aviary reared birds had fewer fractures than conventionals. So we know that the keels had a different shape. We know that their bones were stronger. We didn't measure bone strength in their keels, but they had fewer fractures. Is this due to the keel being stronger? Maybe, but it also might be due to differences in the behavior of the bird. Because a recent paper that's just come out in by the group at UC Davis, where they reared birds in either commercial aviaries or conventional rearing cages. And then they too put the birds into enriched colonies later on for the rest of their life and watched them up to 45 weeks of age. This is an interesting paper. They put little accelerometers on the birds so they could measure their collision forces if they were bumping into things and that sort of thing. And they found that aviary birds actually experienced fewer collisions. And this is, they put them in a, this is a celmet cage or enriched, and it has high perches and lower perches. And they found that the birds that were reared in the aviaries use the higher perches. So, which is common, bird reared in without experience with perches tends not to go up very high. But what's interesting is that fewer collisions. So they knew how to get around better, or were just better at navigating and moving their bodies around a system. If you've ever watched a conventional cage reared bird come out of her housing system as a pullet, and then you put her out in some kind of a test arena, they will actually scare themselves sometimes by flapping their wings because they don't realize they can do that yet quite so far. So they're not quite as good at getting around or managing their bodies so as not to get injured. And so this is evidence for that. So the question is, it's pretty obvious that rearing aviaries are critical for the development of the bird going into aviaries. But what we've been now investigating is, are all rearing aviaries alike? And if you go to the poultry shows and look at the different styles of rearing aviaries, there's many makes and models from different companies around the world, but most of them fall into three general styles that I've have been doing work on and identified. And the one is, I call aviary style 1. And these mainly differ during the first 6 weeks during the brooding period. And they allow the birds a very different early experience. So the first one I call, say, aviary style 1. And Selmet has one. Let's see, we've got a big Dutchman. I think it's the Primus. Whoops. My slides are running themselves. And so there's a bunch of the Vancomatic has one, but basically where you start the chicks is essentially a cage, but it's a little bit bigger and it's got some perches going through it. So here you can see inside, this is a cross section. So if you look at the side, the birds are started in these brooding compartments, and then sometimes they're split if the birds are kept in there for a long time, like they would be in cages when you split for the density. And then at a point in their life, it's opened up, and then when they're open, then the birds are let out to extra perches that are in there, and also a litter area on the floor. So this is probably the least complex for the first 6 weeks. The birds really don't have very much vertical navigation and not a lot of horizontal as well, as they're kept in small compartments. Farmers like this because there's a lot more control over the birds at that time. So a lot of producers are more comfortable with this. The second style of rearing aviary that I call it aviary style 2. Let's see, examples of this are the combi pullet, by Farmer Automatic. Let's see, Chore Time has one. We've got a big Dutchman model, which is the Filia, I think they call it. And in this, chicks are placed in an enclosed a compartment with more vertical space. So this is, it's high, so it is also a compartment that holds, I don't know, 70 bush birds or something like that. But in this compartment, it's taller. And instead of having just small perches over the feeders, as you can see in this cross section, there's a platform at the back and there's several high feeders. So when the birds are started in here, and you can see them jumping up to these platforms and things within the first week or two. So it's a very different experience for those little chicks. Okay, and again, these get opened up, and when the system's open, there's more ramps and platforms and perches, and the birds are then exposed to the litter floor. Aviary style number 3 are probably the least common, but it's the first one that we had at ARCL, actually, at our research station and did our original work with. And so the original Farmer Automatic made a pullet portal that's not manufactured anymore, but Vancomatic has one of these, and the Nevovaria Jumpstart. No, wait, it's Jumpstart is the Vancomatic, and then Nevovaria, it's Janssen. Okay, and so this is very different in that it's open concept. The birds they're brooded in a closed area where they don't have access to the litter, but it's much, much, much larger. And in a commercial barn, this can be the entire length of the barn. And so here you can see the chicks are started on chick paper. And again, they're eventually let out of this onto the litter, but this has a lot more terraces. So rather than extra perches and things, there's perches internal that are being raised all the time. So this is probably the most complex and gives the birds the most opportunity to run through, and they have a lot more both vertical and horizontal space. So when you think about early life, even though these are all aviaries, they're all pretty different. So part of our cluster project that for the poultry cluster research is this investigating the effects of how these different styles of aviaries influence both behavior and musculoskeletal characteristics. Because I remember I told you in our original study, we thought that it was opportunities for exercise, but we didn't actually know what the birds, we never watched and observed what they were doing in there. Here we've set out to look at what their locomotion actually is, and also their musculoskeletal characteristics. So this is Amanda Pufall. She graduated a couple of years ago with her master's degree. Some of you may know Amanda because she did her undergrad in Saskatoon. And her papers on the effects of rearing aviary style and genetic strain on locomotion and musculoskeletal characteristics of the layer pullets. And so in this study, this was our field study to go out and look at hens, what pullets, what producers were doing, and how the birds moved around this system. We also decided to look at not just white strains, but also different feather colors, strains of birds, because we know that that they actually behave a little bit differently in these systems. And we wanted to look at how they develop and actually how they move in them. So this was a field study that was done on commercial farms in Ontario and Alberta. So Egg Farmers of Alberta helped fund some of this research and also helped us find farmers who were gracious enough to let us on their farms. So Amanda and a trusty sidekick at Everywhere visited 15 flocks. So 5 flocks per style 1, style 2, style 3. Remember, style 1 is the most compact, style 3 is the open concept. The flock sizes range from 6,000 to 43,000, so variety. And also when we think about when farmers are opening them, style 1 farmers, they tend to be conservative, anywhere between, now the manufacturers often say you should let them out at 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, or whatever, but producers will manage as they manage. And in these cases, the doors were open between 28 and 48 days of age for style 1. Some producers are quite conservative as far as that goes, and they like to wait until the wing web vaccinations, if they get that at 6 weeks of age. And so they'll wait till then before they let them out. The style 2 were 22 to 28, at least the producers we used. And then style 3 had a pretty big range. But remember, these birds have a free run of the system, a lot more open concept. So what did Amanda do? This was, thank God, it was before the pandemic, but it took a long time. She was on the road, visiting these 15 different flocks. She visited them 3 different times. So sometimes she was flying out to Alberta. She got to take somebody with her, so every day is a field trip in the Widowski lab. They had fun doing this, so the students got to travel. But it was also some late nights, early mornings in the barns, putting up cameras and weighing birds. And so they went, the first visit they went when the systems were closed. So this depended on when the farmers open up their system. The second visit was at about 68 days of age, and the third visit was at 112, so close to sexual maturation. And so their video was put up systematically in all of these different systems for looking inside the compartments and then outside in the free run areas. So video analysis was done. And then we also collected birds. 8 pullets were sampled from these systems, euthanized, and they were brought back to do dissections and look at their bones and their muscles. And so I'm just going to give a couple of examples of what the data look like here. This is so Amanda looked at mostly locomotion type behaviors. So we weren't really interested in, did they feed, drink, preen, that sort of thing. It was like, how are they moving, jumping, and weight bearing in these systems? And so, for example, one of the behavior that was looked at, and you might just from seeing what they look like, running and wing assisted running. So wing assisted running is this, you see chicks doing it all the time where they take off and they're like with their wings. And so they're using their pectoral muscles. And this is a behavior that's quite common in ground dwelling, like galliform birds. Okay. And they use it to get up some speed and go up ramps and things. But as this shown here is the observed amount of time that they were doing wing assisted running at visit 1. So when the systems are closed, this is when they're confined, then 2 and 3. And I don't know if you guys can see the scale here. I'm going to move that down. Okay. I don't know if you can see that. Tell me if I'm hiding. So here's for style 1 is in yellow, 2 and 3. And then down here are browns versus white. And if you look at the differences, we found differences in strain and in style, but it was interacted with visit. So in visit 1, there was a lot of running and wing assisted running going on. And the style 3 where they could do it, the open concept, and then the doors were opened on these. Everyone did a little bit more running or wing assisted running or stayed. And then later on, very little of it was done. And this is when the birds grow up into the system, it gets a little bit more crowded and there's not the free room to do that. Plus, there's probably age and developmental changes in that performance of that behavior. We also see a difference in whites versus browns. So shown here are the white birds versus the browns. And again, in that that 6-week period, the white birds are doing a lot more of it than the browns are. It's a very small percentage of time, as you might, because they do a little spurts of it, but it was still significantly more of it in the open concept and the white birds. Another behavior that we looked at, or that Amanda looked at, were aerial and vertical transitions. And this are because we think that they're load bearing, jumping down. We know that, the impact from jumping causes load on the bones. We know that from high impact aerobics and that sort of thing. And also using those wings again to have the muscle put strain on the keel. And here we see, so aerial and vertical transitions were defined as moving between levels up or down, and then aerials are or when they use their wings. And so here, what's interesting in this is that there's a style by strain interaction, and that in both aerial and vertical transitions. And if you were at my October seminar, you know that white hens are from Venus and brown hens are from Mars, and they do everything differently. And one of those things that they do is white hens go up and brown hens don't as much. And we found that in style 3, white hens did a lot more, significantly more aerial transitions and vertical transitions. So this means that when you put birds in different strains in these different systems, they're actually using the systems differently. Okay, so white birds go up a lot more, and you see them up a lot more in these systems when they have the chance. So the main findings from Amanda were that behaviorally, pullets in style 3 locomoted the most. Most of the difference were at visit 1, when the systems, the brooding compartments were closed, as you might expect, because that's the time when there was really a pretty major difference in between those different styles of aviaries. Okay, and then the white feather birds performed more wing behaviors than browns. Musculoskeletal characteristics, no differences between aviary styles. White feathered strains had proportionally stronger leg bones, and white birds had larger keels and breast muscles. And this is, we've seen this is that with my whites versus browns, whites are either cause or effect. What comes first, the chicken or the egg? What comes first, the keel or the flying? Are they flying more because they have big keels, or do they have big keels because they're flying more? Probably a bit of a combination of both. But whites have the physique and the motivation to go up, and they use it. So that was our field trial. And with field studies, I love doing work on commercial farms, but there's always the problems with the sample size. Although we have watched a huge number of birds, we only had 15 flocks, and there were 5 farms apiece, and some were browns and some were whites, and different management and different lighting and different feed. So we want to also are looking at a much more controlled look at the differences in these aviary systems. So we've got these systems at the Arkell Research Station, and we've got many versions where rather than housing thousands of birds, our little mini versions house between 200 and something and 600. So you've seen these before, because these pictures actually came out of the Arkell. So we've got the style 1. And this is the Big Dutchman is our version of it. We've got a style 2, and this is another Big Dutchman version of it. And then for style 3, we've got our pullet portal from Farmer Automatic, and we have a Nevo Varia. Okay, and so we've run 4 flocks, but in addition to our aviary styles, we also have birds in conventional cages. And so we've got the extreme where they're just as we did in our initial study, where birds don't have the opportunity for exercise very much at all. Again, we're also using browns and whites this time. So we have LSL lights and the white ones, and also LSL brown lights. And so the first student part of the study that we've done is Erin Ross. She is a master's student, and she focused primarily on the musculoskeletal characteristics of the birds. And so she dissected. So here's the basic experimental design. This went on for a long time. We actually managed to get through the pandemic. This shows 2 flocks. We've actually run 4 flocks of birds through these systems, because our aviaries are in a room, and statisticians hate that because our aviaries are confounded with room, and you can't replicate over space. The best that we can do is replicate over time. And so we've run, and because of the breeder flock effects, I never trust any data that only comes out of 1 flock of hens just about anymore, because you always get flock effects. So we've run 1 flock where we got all of the birds, the browns and whites, came from the same hatchery, all hatched on the same day, delivered to our research station, and then put in these different styles, plus the conventional cage, half browns and half whites. So Aaron collected data from the first two flocks, and another student I'll tell you about, we've got data collected from 4 flocks that we've run through. And Aaron collected the samples of birds, euthanized and dissected them at 6, 11, and 16 weeks of age. So the systems in our study, in order to control for this confinement thing, we decided to go conservatively because some of the producers are keeping them for 6 weeks. Many producers will let them out earlier, but we would expect that you might see the biggest difference if you keep them in that long. The systems were open at 6 weeks of age for all styles. So a couple of this has not been published yet. So the previous data that I showed you is you can find in animals. This is an Aaron's thesis. If you go to the University of Guelph Atrium, you can actually find it there, but it hasn't been published yet. We're working on the papers. And so just for an example, so what's different than our previous studies is that she collected the data at the different ages. So we could see the effect of that confinement part as well as then after the birds were let out, with the question being, does aviary system make a difference? So this is a little bit of a complicated graph. This is bone breaking strength adjusted for body weight of the animal. And it is for, we get time by system by strain interactions for everything. And for those of you who are the scientists in this crowd, you know that 3-way interactions are awful. They're awful to show. However, in this case, they're really, really interesting. So shown on here is, these are browns, browns, browns. So these are the brown birds at 6, 11, and 16 weeks of age. And then these are all the whites, 6, 11, and 16 weeks of age. And then the bars are style 1 blue, style 2 orange, style 3 gray. And the outlier that you can see right away is a conventional cage. It's so obvious. So this graph is of the humerus data shown as representative of the wing bones. She also did the radius and found that similar results. And so what you see here is that early on, well, throughout the rearing period, conventional caged birds have significantly weaker bones than the any of the aviary reared birds. However, at 6 weeks of age, so during the confinement, there's actually differences between birds in style 1 versus the birds in style 2 and 3. So this is where birds have more jumping and flying ability. They can go up versus and the open concept. And so at 6 weeks of age, that environment is actually influencing the strength of the bones at that age. Okay. And then, but after they're let out and they continue to grow and get exercise later on, remember they're constantly exercising, loading, and the bone is continuously responding to this. Those differences between the aviary systems go away, but they're still different than conventional cages. Bone morphology. Remember I said the shape of the bone can change. The shape of the size of the keel changes when we compared conventional to aviary. And Aaron also measured the diameter and the lengths of the various leg and wing bones. And here is a graph of the humerus. So it's again a representative. And again, we see a housing style by strain, by age interaction. And again, you see that there's differences in 6 weeks of age in white birds, mostly. These aren't significantly different here from each other, except for style 2 versus conventional. And here, style 2 ended up being this outlier. And we didn't expect it because we thought it was increasing complexity. But actually, the birds have to do more up and down. They have more vertical space and less horizontal space in the system. So it turned out to be a bit more of an outlier for us. But so at 6 weeks of age, and we saw this at only in whites. Remember, the whites too are probably, they are going up and you jumping up and doing more vertical transitions in this housing system when it's closed, and you actually see an effect on the growth patterns of their bones. So the diameter and the length are different. And then again, once they're all let out and they're doing more similar things, it disappears. And why does this go down? These are all corrected for body weight. So as body weight goes up, the proportion goes down. So that's why you see the difference over age. So the main findings of air and stuff is that aviary birds had stronger wing bones and femurs than cage-reared birds, and that style 2 birds had proportionally wider, longer bones at the first 6 weeks. So when they're different confinement, you see differences, but then those go away, and all aviaries end up being the same. White birds, again, had larger keels. Okay, second study, we're finding that study after study. Okay. Joanne Chu, who also did work on browns versus whites and lighting, not a part of the aviary comparisons, but part of her whole cluster project, also found differences between browns and whites. Muscle weights, again, too, this is mainly due to the effect of age and styles that are different. We didn't get an interaction here, but proportionally heavier breast muscles in aviaries compared to conventional cages. No difference across aviaries. So the main findings with our musculoskeletal things is aviary birds, just like in our original, the Casey Trott papers, aviary birds had proportionally larger muscles. And they also had higher mineral content when we ran them through DEX. I didn't show you that. And compared to browns, whites tended to have the heavier breasts and lighter leg muscles, as we've seen before. So the last couple of minutes I'll spend showing you, talking about, this is my PhD student, Anna Wrench, who's been looking at behavioral differences. She's also tracking some birds through to the end of lay. We have looking at keel fractures and those sorts of things. But her thesis is primarily considering behavioral differences in these birds and their ability to navigate different spatial tasks, their fear behavior. And what you can see here is she quantified, you can see in this video, this is what they're doing. See their little wing assisted running. So they do a lot more in the system. And some of the times they spend the whole day running back and forth. And you can imagine it's a completely different exercise environment than in the other birds. And so she's also doing navigational tests, like having birds jump up to different platforms for food rewards and training them to go. Do they go straight up? Do they take different, are they able to get up here? And this is similar to the Gunnarsson test, for those of you in the audience who know what the original perching test is. She's doing fear tests. This is a novel object, a novel arena, and a novel object test, and also some tests for learning and cognition. And here's an example with a Y maze, or I'm sorry, a T maze test. And so in her T maze learning test, so just a couple of the highlights, she's still writing up a lot of the stuff. Some of it will be presented at PSA, I'm presenting for her, and some in Paris. She'll be presenting herself, so make sure you come find her, those talks. So the T maze learning test that she did it when they were really little, and then again at 14 weeks of age. So for all of her tests, the birds lived in those aviaries, and then she would take them out to do the test, and then test them in another environment. In some cases, if the birds required training or habituation, like the 14-week-old birds, they were moved out of the aviaries and into open pens for the time of the testing period, and then they went back into the aviaries. So they were tested at 14 weeks of age. And in this case, because we discovered browns and whites are motivated by different things, we trained them to go for a food reward, that you see in that red dish. Also, an alternative reward that they could go to is you open up the top and give them the opportunity to escape. Some think escape is a much better reward than food in there. And so we found that we got a lot more participation if they were offered both. Output was a number of trials needed to reach learning criteria. And learning criteria meant that the birds had to go 4 successes and 5 trials. So they were put through here, showed that green is your, not green, but left and green is your correct color to go out. And then the birds had to learn that that was their way to go. And they had took 15 trials max. So they had to get it 4, go right in. And so what's shown here is there was a style effect, and this is a survivorship curve. And so what this shows is the proportion of birds. So one, that's 100% of the birds here would reach criteria. And this is how many trials it took them to reach criteria. And here's the different styles, and conventionals are the purple. And you can see here the conventionals, the purples were not as successful at all. There's significantly different. These are hazard ratios. And so the birds here, style 2, style 3, they finished. So these birds reached learning criteria, the proportion of birds quicker. So aviary 3, open concept, learned faster than conventionals, and aviary 2 were faster than conventionals as well. Okay, so rearing, that early experience did make a difference in how well they learned to complete that test, or they were less fearful of it. Another example of one of the tests that were done, and this is actually an Aaron's thesis, but using birds that Anna had worked with and trained for some of these, that complex spatial navigation. This task, birds were trained to go to a food reward where they had to go to either up to get this food reward. It was 60 centimeters high. They could either jump on the platform or walk up the ramp. Here, the birds were put on the ramp, and here's the food reward, and they could either walk down the ramp or jump off the platform to get to the food reward. And here is a harder one. This is, they had to go up. No, they had to go down from 120 centimeters. Okay, so they had to jump down, or they could take the ramp at a much higher jump and get down to this food reward. And so shown here are the different, I think she did about 300 tests overall involving all of the birds. And here you can see this is the success rates for birds from style 1, 2, 3 and conventionals. So what was the easiest test was jumping down 60 centimeters. Okay, put the bird up there. Okay, I'm going to come down. And they had a certain amount of time to do it in. And just about everybody from the aviaries and most birds from the conventional cages jumped down. There were some conventional cage birds who are like, I'm not moving, who didn't go down. The second difficult test was going down from 120 centimeters. Again, you can see success rates are a little bit lower for everybody. This was a bit of a harder task, and conventionals did the poorest. And going up, we can see that here we see style differences, and this was non-parametric tests. These were significantly different in that conventional cages, no one jumped up to get that food reward, and style 3 birds were the most successful. So in jumping tasks, and when we put birds in these, you take the birds out of the different aviaries and the different rearing treatments, the graduate students and all the researchers were blind. So we had people move them into the pens who did not know, so that the students did not know what type of aviary they were coming from. They obviously weren't blind to brown versus white, but they were blind to the aviary. And you can walk through that room and you know exactly who's out of the conventional cage because they are all on the floor and the other birds were up. So even though you're blinded to that rearing aviary, it was pretty obvious from the bird's behavior kind of where they came from. And so overall, we're still getting more data out, working on our papers. It's pretty fun and exciting stuff. And at least body-wise and behavior-wise, you can build a better laying hen by putting her in the right environment. And so early experience in rearing system has profound and lifelong effects on their muscles, their skeletons. It's amazing how their bones are a different shape depending on the house that they grew up in when they were little. The type of activities and locomotion and the exercise they do in different aviaries do actually differ across system design. So open concept versus the small compartments, the birds do behave differently. And it seems like that this does influence some of their spatial, physical, and learning skills. Okay. The biggest difference overall is aviary versus conventional. The other differences between the systems themselves are a lot more subtle. But we also know that there's the different strains use the different systems differently. So whites take advantage of, if you give them more opportunities for exercise, whites take advantage of it. Browns don't necessarily do. And this has different influences on their bones and muscles. And so eventually, as we know about more and more about this, our goal should be to optimize the physical and behavioral development by putting the right pullet in the right system with the right management. And so I'd also like to mention that with this poultry cluster project, I'm also collaborating with researchers from McGill, and they're biomedical scientists who specialize in bone biology, and they are doing more complex investigations with the bones from our hens and with our hens themselves. And so that will be forthcoming as well. And also, thank you very much to all of the funders for a lot of this work. And I'm happy to take questions now. I will stop sharing. Thanks.
Thanks, Tia. You covered a lot. So thank you.
Too fast.
No, I wouldn't say too fast. It's just you guys are doing a lot of work. So I appreciate I appreciate that. I just want to remind folks that if you do have any questions, please put them in the question and answer box, and we'll work through them. We are just past the hour now. So Tina, I hope it's okay if we take you just another 15 minutes or so and through the question. And folks, if you have to leave, we totally understand. And just know that the recording will be available so that if you miss the question and answer period, you can always catch up with us a little bit later through the recording. So we do have some questions here. It says, thanks for the presentation. Do these aviary systems have different types or sizes of the perches? The diameter of the perch shown in the picture seems big for the chicks at a young age.
Most of them have, the ones we have, actually they're almost very much hen size. They don't have little bitty, like pullet sized perches in them at all. And so that's one thing I'm hoping to study soon, is looking at, so they certainly cannot grasp it, but they are usually hen size. And part of the problem with the pullet aviary too is that they grow into the system. And so that bird is changing so much when she's this big, and then she ends up as just about a hen, right? So from a design aspect, it's designed to protect them when they're little chicks, and then later on it's yeah, they're not chick-sized perches by any means.
But as you said, they kind of grow into them almost, you know, they get used to them. So folks, I'll just remind you, if you do have questions, put them in the question and answer box. Here's a question from Mauricio, coming to us from Brazil. Considering all this amazing data collection, the challenges of the Canadian egg industry related to animal welfare are the same, or are they changing according to new data or information that each experiment brings? So are the codes changing based on the information that's coming out from your lab and others?
Yeah, yes, they probably will. Most of the codes and the egg farm or United Egg Producers in the States, they're rewriting their guidelines for cage-free. These are pretty much living, they're supposed to be living documents, and they're supposed to be reviewed every 5 years. In Canada, our codes are supposed to be reviewed every 5 years. They're a huge amount of work, and I'm terrified because our 5 years are over. I was on the first code development committee, and so I think there will definitely be adjustments, because the other thing is that when we're on the code committee and we're involved in it, there is a list of research priorities that are gaps in the knowledge. So lighting for pullets is one. I know Dr. Schwein-Lardner, I think she's on here, is doing a lot of work in that area. We don't know anything about these. Pullets are a whole new section. Before the Canadian code, there were no pullet guidelines pretty much anywhere in the world. We're the first, and then we're seeing more and more develop. So some of our stuff we might have gotten wrong because there just wasn't the information, and definitely we'll be modifying it. And I'm pleased because in the past, one of the most rewarding parts about this job is that you do see your results changing the guidelines, and they do. Yeah. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's perfect. I appreciate that you said they're a lot of work, because I don't think folks generally realize how much effort goes into writing those codes and why it seems to take so long. But it is quite a very involved process to make that happen. So we want to get it as right as we can before we sort of put it into a code. So I appreciate that. A comment here, or a question from Sasha. Hi, Tina. Great presentation. I was wondering if you know about if there could be differences for birds reared in outdoor access versus, example, organic systems and non-outdoor access systems.
Differences in terms of behaviorally, or their musculoskeletal characteristics, or all of the above?
All of the above. She didn't specify, but I imagine given what you've talked about in your presentation, she's thinking about those things.
Yes. Well, when birds are given a, what you see is there's a lot of research going on in Australia, tons actually, on free range, because that's mostly where their industry's gone, because they have the room and space for it, and kind of the climate, it's pretty desert-like in a lot of Australia. But I think most of the work is looking at why do some birds go out and some birds not go out, because you see a huge amount of variation in the birds that go out and don't. And so there are temperament differences, and those sorts of things in terms of the ones who go out or not. I am not familiar with anybody looking at differences in bones and muscles of having outdoor access versus not. I imagine it would all depend on travel distance and the type of activity that they're doing. Behaviorally, from a rearing standpoint, I think rearing makes a huge difference, as it does the nature of the environment. No self-respecting descendant of a red jungle fowl will go out into a place where there's where there's no trees and there's a sky and there's buzzards and stuff, right?
Yeah.
They want to be under things. And so the style of the range makes a huge difference, and whether there's any kind of shelter on it and that sort of thing. So I don't think I answered your question, but I tried.
Yeah, so there's some work, but probably not specifically as it relates to what Tina's looking at with the bones.
I do know that some work with looking at, I think birds that tend to go out and spend a lot of, who venture out more, may have lower laying rates. I don't know. When you think about it, venturing out, like when you want birds to put their energy into eggs, and then the ones that go outdoors don't, there's only so much energy to go around. So it's a bit of a problem, isn't it? In terms of
for sure. Sasha said thank you, and great answer. I have some questions, Tina, and I perhaps I missed this, and I think you said it, that are you taking those birds into lay, like the ones that you did the bone breaking strength and that type of stuff, but you haven't finished that work yet?
No, we've taken them. Okay, so there's a couple flocks. See, part of the problem with this project is we ended up putting in these pullet systems, and we didn't have enough laying hen systems to put them in, right? Because it's big. They're like, I think we ran 10,000 birds through those flocks. And so we only have 2 small aviaries. And so Anna Ranch moved brown birds into our adult aviaries, and she watched where they spent their time and laid their eggs when they were first moved in, not conventionals. It would have been style 1 and 3, I think, that she compared.
Yeah,
because browns are vertically challenged. So it's the browns that we worry about that don't do as well. And then we have got some that we've put into our enriched caging systems where we have more capacity for. And we've taken those out to the very end. And Anna has done radiographs on them to look at their keel status. So we haven't looked at bone breaking strength, but we've measured their keels and what their keels are like. So that would be for all 4 systems and both colors.
Good. Yeah,
And
that really was my question. And, you know, because you started your presentation talking about, you know, the keel challenges and that type of thing. And so I'm just wondering, you know, is that outcome affected
yeah.
by these different systems? So,
And then the McGill folks, we kept some of them in enriched cages and we've sent, and well, some of the birds, actually, the folks at McGill, we gave them some live birds and they were doing bone loading, and hopefully it would be cool to get Bettina sometime to talk about all their findings that are still coming out, because they've got beautiful toys where they're strain gauging the bones and then looking at micro CT. And so we had birds at 30, 50, and 70 weeks of age that we kept a small population, and those birds went to McGill. So I don't have the expertise or things to look at the finite. So they're looking at keels, and they're also looking at all the different properties of the bones from those birds as well. So
good. I have a question. Just, you know, you did the field trial, which was a ton of work. I can appreciate that. You know, the travel alone, it takes up so much time and effort, and so I can appreciate that. I just wonder, you know, we're always talking about when we do these studies, and of course that's the point, to look at them from the effect it has on bird biology and behavior and that type of thing. But I'm wondering a little bit about the farmers and the choices that they made, and maybe some of the thoughts that went into those systems. Did you get any sense of that? Because that's the other thing. Like, we might have the ultimate system for the bird, but if it is too hard for a farmer to manage, or it doesn't allow him to reach his goals, then it's never going to happen. So trying to find that balance, I guess, is you know.
absolutely. And that's why I field trials like that cost a fortune, and it took a lot of time, and we got one paper out of it, right? And you're like,
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
will we ever get more? Probably not. But you know what the value is? You're actually working with producers. You are finding out what's realistic or not. You can come up with any kind of, here's how to make the perfect bird, but if the management's terrible, it's never going to get adopted if it's too hard to do, right?
Right.
From a management standpoint, but also I think from a knowledge translation standpoint, actually having the farmers think about, like, what are you doing and what are you measuring has huge value in it. So it's a different sort of value for that field research. Absolutely. But yes, there are different ways. There are different comfort levels that farmers have. And there's also trade-offs where that open concept seems like, oh, like that's really cool for the birds, but you get some rough starts in those too, because they aren't right. And depending on the quality of the chicken, you can get some rough starts and have more mortality in the first week or so, because it is more open. And some producers will do things like, you know, if you started birds on the floor and you put chick paper around, like to get them into a corner, that's a possibility. And so there are maybe some other management tricks like that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And I think the word trade-offs is one word that we don't use enough. It is because there's always choices to be made, and there's never the 100% system. So I like that. You know, you have to kind of choose between one or the other, but trying to find that balance. I have one more question, and folks, if you have any more questions, please put them in that question and answer, and then we'll release Tina. She's probably tired after all that talking, but I just wonder, some of the measurements that you're taking and the things that you're discovering, you know, you talked about the McGill group doing the micro CT work and that kind of stuff. Does that ever get translated, or how does that get translated back to some of the breeding companies? I'm a geneticist at heart, so I have to ask these questions. Are there measurements that you think you might recommend to a breeding company that says, you know, if you are selecting birds for these newer systems, these are things that you might want to start considering if they haven't already. I mean, they probably have, nobody tells you their secrets, but here are some key measurements that would be important for birds, regardless of what aviary system they went into.
You mean like bone parameters or that sort of thing?
Yeah, bone or muscle or, you know, or behavior, you know,
Do they
you
have
measured
the
some of
answer?
those behavior things. Maybe it's some of those things.
I haven't, with this particular project, I haven't worked directly with any genetic companies, and we've been using Loman because we started with Loman and should use other birds more often because they're not the only white and brown ones that are out there. Hopefully, so all the genetics companies have really good scientists like Sasha, and hopefully they're reading our papers.
Yeah, true enough, true enough, true enough. But even if they are reading their papers, there's a lot of information in there. So I'd be like, oh,
Right.
which one's important? And I guess I'm asking, which ones do you think are key measurements? Which are the most telling, the most important?
I know one for the keel fractures because I didn't really talk about it today. We're finding, and this is true we did it with DeKalb's and it was a DeKalb, a Loman, and something else. The keel, okay, the calcification of the keel. So we also quantify the percentage of cartilage when we do the keel area, the keel size, the percentage of cartilage. The percentage of cartilage is always higher in the browns than it is in the whites. And we've looked and we found that. And so once I find something once, I'm like, okay, I think we have something here, but we've seen it again and again, is that the browns keels are not as calcified when they're going into lay. So the browns will come into lay sooner and their keels are more cartilaginous on the end. And so a lot of the keel fractures that we see are those caudal tip fractures. And we're because starting to think now that keel fractures are not just, they just don't have to do with bumping into things. There's something else going on that are causing these tip fractures. And potentially it's the way that the keel shifts down when the bird comes into puberty, like her pelvis and her keel is shifting. And it might be that they're already producing a large egg. So it's like babies having babies, right? Kind of. So they may not, their keel isn't fully developed at that time. And the only paper that's out there on the development of the keel and when it calcifies is from like 1946.
Very interesting.
So that's another thing that my collaborator Bettina Willie and her grad student are going to look at. And so birds have changed a lot since then. And so I think that that's a huge thing that I think that is probably contributing to it a lot.
It's very interesting, you know, often if we go back into the papers, you know, from decades ago, there's a clue there that will that we have better tools and abilities now to investigate further. So thank you for that, Tina. That, I mean, it's really interesting. You know, you mentioned a couple things. If you're looking for a research project, check out the gaps in the codes of practice, and then some of these other things that you just mentioned, like the sort of maturation of the calcification of the keel. So very interesting. I know there's a ton of work still to be done, and we look forward to seeing the rest of these projects, you know, through the lay period. So.